If you're listening to this, you probably know the feeling.
Oh, absolutely. It's almost universal at this point.
It's this state that, science doesn't really have a perfect name for yet, but we all recognize it.
The wired but tired paradox.
Exactly. You're completely exhausted. Maybe you're physically drained dealing with these low-grade aches and pains.
But the moment you actually try to get some rest,
your brain just switches on. It's like this internal planning committee calls an emergency meeting right when you lie down.
right, you just can't switch off. You're always alert, always processing something.
And, we've all been sort of conditioned to think that this feeling, this combination of exhaustion and being hyper-alert is some kind of moral failing.
That you lack discipline or you just need a better vacation.
Right. But our mission today is to just cut through all of that noise. We're doing a deep dive into the source material. We're talking neurobiology, HPA axis research, electrophysiological studies on burnout.
And we're going to show that this is not a character flaw. Being chronically exhausted and constantly alert is a predictable, even a quantifiable biological state. It's the result of chronic, low-grade stress.
That's the absolute core of this deep dive. We want to provide the intelligent, the technical explanation for what you're actually living through.
Exactly.
The documents we've pulled together, they range from, molecular analyses of the HPA axis feedback loop all the way to detailed profiles of dopamine instability. They show us the real molecular cost of this constant cognitive grind.
So we're going to explore why the stress we face today feels so invisible but is so constant.
And how the body's main stress hormone, cortisol, is silently disrupting your sleep, your focus, your immune system.
And maybe most importantly, we'll get into what the science actually says about true, lasting neurological recovery.
Our goal here is really to move beyond that generic advice of just relax.
And equip you with the knowledge of why your brain and body feel this way. Because understanding the mechanism, that's the first real step toward a strategic intervention, not just a temporary fix.
So let's start by redefining stress itself. Because when we hear that word, I think our minds immediately jump to the dramatic.
The classic fight or flight.
Right, the acute emergency, a car swerving towards you. But the kind of stress that really defines modern fatigue, it doesn't look like that at all.
No, it looks like an infinite to-do list.
Exactly.
And we have to be clear, stress, as a broad term, it covers everything from, beneficial challenges, the good stress that helps you adapt and grow.
Eustress, right?
Right, eustress, all the way to outright trauma.
Yeah.
But for most of us in contemporary society, chronic stress is it's almost unavoidable part of daily life.
So the central point in the source material is what? That the brain is the command center for all of this.
The brain is the central organ of stress and adaptation, period. It's your brain that perceives a threat, and it doesn't really matter if that threat is a predator or, 100 unread emails demanding a response.
It determines the physiological reaction regardless.
It determines the entire behavioral and physiological cascade that follows.
So my brain can register an overflowing inbox with the same biological alarm bells as a real physical danger, even if the result is just me sitting paralyzed at my desk.
Functionally, at the initial level, yes. And this process is what introduced the concept of allostasis a few decades back.
Allostasis, let's break that down.
Allostasis is simply how the body maintains stability, what we used to call homeostasis, by changing its internal systems in response to a stressor. These responses are all about short-term adaptation.
So they're supposed to be helpful.
Oh, absolutely necessary and adaptive. Increasing your heart rate, mobilizing glucose for energy, sharpening your focus. These are all good things if you need to solve a problem right now.
But what happens if the problem is never really solved? If the threat, like that inbox, never actually goes away?
Then the system that was designed for a temporary sprint is now being forced to run a marathon.
And that's the critical distinction.
That's everything. When these adaptive responses are just overused, when the system becomes chronically dysregulated because the threat of the daily grind is relentless, that beneficial allostasis, it tips over into damage.
And that damage has a name.
That damage is what we call allostatic load, or, in severe cases, allostatic overload.
I like the analogy you used before we started about the car engine.
Right. Think of it like pushing your car's engine into the red zone. The car can handle that for a few minutes, right? Yeah. To overtake someone.
Sure.
But if you drive with the needle in the red for days or weeks or months, you're going to get engine failure. Allostatic overload is that cumulative physiological wear and tear. It's the cost of your body repeatedly trying to adapt to these chronic psychosocial stressors.
which makes the constant background noise of modern life. The 24/7 news, the social media notifications, the always-on work culture. So much more insidious than one single big stressful event.
It's the invisibility and the persistence. And the main neuroendocrine system that mediates this entire shift from helpful adaptation to damaging overload is the hypothalamic-pituitary-adrenal axis.
Okay, the HPA axis. It's a mouthful of an acronym, but let's break its function down simply. It's the body's central stress response system, and it works on a feedback loop, right?
It does. The HPA axis is the master regulator. So it starts in the hypothalamus in your brain, which releases a hormone CRH when it perceives stress.
Right.
CRH then travels a tiny distance to the pituitary gland and signals it to release another hormone, ACTH.
And that ACTH is the messenger that goes out into the body.
Exactly. ACTH travels through the bloodstream down to the adrenal glands, which sit right on top of your kidneys, and it tells them to produce and release the main event, cortisol.
And cortisol is what floods the body and creates all those physiological changes we feel when we're stressed.
That's the one. But here's the elegant part. The feedback loop. How is it supposed to regulate itself?
It's designed to be that self-correcting thermostat.
Perfectly put. In an acute situation, that rush of elevated cortisol is actually a signal back up the chain. Cortisol binds to receptors in both the hypothalamus and the pituitary.
And that tells them to stop.
It tells them to inhibit further secretion. It's the off switch. It dampens the response and brings the whole system back to baseline once the immediate threat has passed.
But the core of the problem for so many people listening is that this thermostat is, well, it's broken.
It's completely broken. Chronic stress fundamentally disrupts this delicate balance. The system becomes dysregulated, and this can show up in a couple of ways.
Right.
Either the system stays stubbornly hyperactivated, just producing way too much cortisol even when it's not needed, or over a long time, the receptors upstream in the brain become less sensitive to the cortisol signals.
So the off switch doesn't work anymore. The shouting gets ignored.
The system can't turn itself off effectively. And this constant low-grade churning just burns out the system's ability to fine-tune its own response.
You also mentioned that the way this system functions isn't just about our current stress levels. That seems like a really important layer. What are the three main factors that control our long-term cortisol exposure?
Right. The source material makes it very clear that our HPA axis function is multi-layered. It's shaped over our entire lifetime. The three big factors are, first, your genetic background.
So what you're born with.
Right, the basic integrity and sensitivity of your stress-regulating genes. Second, and this is a huge one, is your early life environment.
Okay, let's spend a moment on that. What does that entail?
It's incredibly powerful. We're talking about things like prenatal exposure to a mother's stress hormones, any childhood trauma, and even, very subtle differences in maternal interaction patterns.
Wow, so even just the style of parenting can shape this.
It can. Research on maternal behavior shows that what's called an impoverished maternal environment can lead to disorganized care that results in an overreactive HPA axis in the offspring for life.
And how? What's the mechanism?
It comes down to epigenetic modification. This is where the environment actually changes how your genes are expressed. In this case, it alters the glucocorticoid receptor gene. The DNA code itself doesn't change.
But the volume knob gets turned up or down.
Precisely. The volume knob for how sensitive that receptor is to cortisol's off signal gets adjusted, potentially permanently.
So if you had a really stressful childhood, your HPA axis thermostat might be permanently set to highly sensitive.
That's exactly right.
Which means your biological reaction to, say, a mild traffic jam today could be massively amplified because of wiring that was laid down decades ago.
And that explains so much about why some people seem incredibly resilient to immense stress, while others really struggle with what seem like relatively minor inputs. The stress from your job today is always being filtered through that genetic and developmental history.
Which brings us to the third factor.
Which is, of course, your current life stress.
So now that we understand this HPA axis is always running in the background, let's talk about what's keeping the engine revving so constantly today. The cognitive drivers of this chronic load.
The primary culprit really is the sheer volume of cognitive tasks we face every day. And this is best captured by the concept of decision fatigue.
Decision fatigue. To a skeptic, that might sound like an excuse for poor planning or just being tired. Is this a real biological thing?
It is definitively a brain-based biological phenomenon. It is not a weakness. You have to remember the brain's enormous energy demands.
It's something like 2% of our body weight, but uses 20% of our energy.
Around 20% of our total glucose supply, and it needs that supply constantly. So when you engage in excessive decision-making, which is an incredibly taxing cognitive process, you rapidly deplete those neural energy reserves. This isn't laziness, it's literal resource exhaustion.
So when my willpower just collapses at 3 in the afternoon and I grab the easiest, unhealthiest snack,
Yeah.
it's not a failure of my character. My brain's command center's just starved.
That's it. And the part of the brain that runs out of gas first is the prefrontal cortex, or the PFC. It sits right behind your forehead.
The CEO of the brain.
The CEO, the command center for all your executive functions. Reasoning, complex planning, self-control, weighing consequences. When its energy reserves dip, its ability to function rationally just plummets.
You stop reasoning and you start reacting.
You do. Your brain starts desperately looking for cognitive shortcuts to conserve energy, which leads to impulsive behavior or poorly considered choices.
And the really unique poison of modern life is the sheer number of these tiny micro decisions that are constantly taxing the PFC.
Absolutely. The stress of the modern grind is so often invisible. It's not one huge life-altering decision. It's the compounding cumulative effect of hundreds of small ones, all demanding a tiny slice of that limited glucose supply.
Like what? Give us some examples.
Choosing the right font for a document. Selecting the exact right tone for a 2-sentence email. Deciding which streaming service to open. Picking an emoji in a group chat to convey the correct emotional subtext. Deciding whether or not to like a social media post that just popped up.
These aren't dangerous tasks, but they all demand a continuous allocation of resources.
And when you combine this relentless stream of micro decisions with the demands of constant multitasking, I mean, think about being on a video call where you have to monitor your own appearance while you're also trying to read and respond to chat messages and manage a complex assignment. The PFC never, ever gets a break.
It's cognitive resource depletion 24/7.
And this is the paradox of choice, just amplified by technology.
Where having an abundance of options actually makes us more stressed because we're worried about making the optimal choice.
That's the psychological pressure that keeps the HPA axis revving. We are just drowning in options, and social media makes it worse by presenting this endless stream of information, convincing your brain that if you just scroll one more time, you might find something better, something you're missing out on.
That fear of missing out.
That constant low-grade fear, coupled with time pressure and social comparison, generates immense cognitive stress. And that invisible load is what sustains the hyperactivation of the HPA axis, guaranteeing that we tip over from helpful acute stress into damaging chronic allostatic overload.
Okay, so we've established that this cognitive grind keeps the HPA axis constantly running, which means we're being flooded with cortisol. And we know cortisol is essential for survival, right? It's the body's primary anti-inflammatory. It mobilizes energy.
It's vital.
But at what biological point does it switch from being this adaptive, helpful tool to a chronic, damaging threat?
The threshold is crossed when the exposure becomes chronic. Acutely, in the short term, cortisol is fantastic. It temporarily enhances your memory retrieval, it sharpens your attention, and it's a potent anti-inflammatory. It's what ensures your body can react effectively to a real danger.
It's the survival fuel that gets us through a crisis.
Exactly. But prolonged chronic exposure leads to what we call maladaptive effects. And what's really groundbreaking, according to the research we analyzed, is that the stress response isn't just a function of high cortisol levels alone.
That seems like a really vital nuance. I think most people assume that if their cortisol is high, that's the whole problem.
But the sources suggest it's the interplay between high cortisol and other circuits in the brain that becomes truly toxic.
So it's a combination of factors.
Absolutely. The researchers investigated this by looking at 3 key neurobiological components at the same time in experimental models. So they looked at 1, high corticosterone, which is the rodent equivalent of cortisol.
Yeah, high stress hormone.
2, electrical stimulation of the amygdala, which is the brain's emotional alarm center. So this represents heightened fear, vigilance, emotional arousal.
Right, the alarm system is ringing.
And 3, inhibition of the medial prefrontal cortex, the MPFC, which represents a loss of that top-down, rational executive control.
So, to summarize, the body is flooded with stress hormones, the emotional alarm system is screaming, and the rational CEO of the brain is offline.
That is the perfect summary, and here's the truly fascinating discovery. Administering the high-stress hormone alone did not impair memory in these models.
Wow.
Stimulating the amygdala alone did not impair memory, and inhibiting the prefrontal cortex alone also did not impair memory.
But the combination.
The combined treatment, that
Right.
perfect storm of heightened emotional input from the amygdala, plus the loss of executive control from the PFC, plus the flood of the stress hormone, that was sufficient to perfectly mimic the profound memory and cognitive impairments you see after severe, uncontrollable behavioral stress, like prolonged physical restraint.
That's incredible. So you could literally be swimming in cortisol. But if your prefrontal cortex is still strong and online, and you're not in a state of high emotional arousal, your brain can manage it.
It can buffer the negative effects.
But the second those three things align, the amygdala screaming, the PFC paralyzed, and the cortisol surging, that is the neurobiological signature of truly toxic, uncontrollable stress.
And it reveals a profound truth about how we should approach managing modern stress. If you can't always eliminate the cognitive load that's causing the cortisol surge, your strategy has to pivot.
To strengthening the regulatory systems.
Exactly. Strengthening the prefrontal cortex and the vagus nerve to prevent that toxic combination from ever forming in the first place. You have to keep the PFC online as the ultimate stress break.
So if that toxic combination runs chronically, what are the physical consequences inside the brain? Where can we actually measure the damage?
The damage is tangible and quantifiable, and is particularly concentrated in two main regions. First, the hippocampus,
Which is critical for memory.
memory formation, specifically creating new declarative memories, and also for regulating mood. And it's highly vulnerable because it has this incredibly dense concentration of glucocorticoid receptors. It's just wired to listen closely to cortisol.
So how does chronic cortisol physically affect it? Does it just stop working as well, or does it actually change shape?
It physically changes shape
Physically, yeah.
dramatically. Chronic cortisol elevation causes what's known as dendritic shrinkage or atrophy. The dendrites are the complex tree-like branches of the neurons.
And do they just wither?
They wither. It also reduces synaptic spine density, meaning the actual physical connection points between neurons are lost. Imagine pruning the leaves and branches off a dense herald tree until it's just a skeleton.
And with it, the capacity for complex information processing is just gone.
It's severely diminished, so when you feel like your memory is foggy or you can't seem to learn new things as quickly as you used to, that's a direct physical consequence. The wiring is literally shrinking because of chronic stress.
That's a sobering thought.
And it goes further. Chronic stress also suppresses adult neurogenesis. That's the birth of new neurons in a part of the hippocampus called the dentate gyrus. So the result is these measurable impairments in memory, in learning, and a much higher susceptibility to anxiety and depression because the hippocampus is so vital for mood regulation.
And the second brain area that takes a big hit is the prefrontal cortex, which we already know was struggling with decision fatigue.
Yes, the PFC. The seat of complex thinking, planning, impulse control. It's also directly impaired by chronic cortisol exposure. If you find yourself unable to hold a complex argument in your head, if you struggle to plan beyond the immediate next task, or if you find yourself losing your temper easily, that PFC impairment is the neurological explanation.
The hardware required for executive function is literally degrading.
It is. And this cascading damage brings us right back to the most visceral symptom of all this. That clinical paradox of being wired but tired.
You're physically exhausted, but you are mentally hyper-alert and you cannot sleep.
This is the absolute signature of HPA axis dysregulation. And the wired sensation, it stems from a state of profound hyperarousal in the brain. Specifically, the wake-promoting brain systems like the ascending reticular activating system, or ARRS, in the brainstem.
They fail to power down.
They get stuck in the on position. They maintain these abnormally elevated firing rates, keeping your brain in a state of high vigilance even when you should be in deep sleep. You are physically exhausted, but your nervous system is absolutely convinced there is still an emergency.
And that is physiologically incompatible with restorative sleep.
Completely. And the HPA axis makes this even worse through circadian disruption.
Right, because cortisol is supposed to be high in the morning to wake us up and low at night.
That's the ideal healthy rhythm. You should have a sharp peak called the cortisol awakening response, or CAR-R, shortly after you wake up. And then, over the course of the day, cortisol should steadily decline, reaching its lowest point late in the evening.
But when the HPA axis is chronically active,
those evening cortisol levels remain elevated when they should be at rock bottom.
and elevated evening cortisol Actively suppresses the production of melatonin, the sleep hormone.
Precisely. If your body is still pumping out stress hormones at 10 o'clock at night, it is physiologically impossible to initiate the deep restorative sleep cycles that you need for healing.
And that kicks off a truly horrific self-perpetuating cycle.
It's the ultimate vicious loop because a lack of restorative sleep is, in itself, a massive physiological stressor. So poor sleep increases your cortisol levels the next day, which further impairs your glucose tolerance, which worsens systemic inflammation, which disrupts your gut health. The whole system just spirals downward in a cycle of hormonal and inflammatory chaos.
Okay, let's talk more about that inflammation. This is a point of confusion for a lot of people because we use cortisol as a potent anti-inflammatory drug, right? Like a steroid shot. So how can chronic cortisol exposure lead to more inflammation?
This is where the detail of how receptors work becomes absolutely critical. Acutely, in short bursts, cortisol is a brilliant anti-inflammatory. But prolonged chronic elevation leads to a state known as glucocorticoid receptor resistance, or GRR.
Okay, walk us through what that resistance looks like at a cellular level.
So when cortisol enters a cell, it's supposed to bind to a glucocorticoid receptor, or GR, inside the cell. This hormone receptor complex then moves into the cell's nucleus and binds to the DNA to regulate gene expression.
Essentially telling it to turn off the production of inflammatory messengers.
Right, it's the off switch for inflammation. But under chronic stress, a couple of things happen. First, the number of these receptors can decrease. That's called downregulation. And second, the receptors that are left might be impaired in their ability to bind to cortisol or to correctly execute the signal once they're inside the nucleus.
So even though your blood is saturated with cortisol, the cells are essentially going deaf to its signal.
That's the perfect way to describe it. The anti-inflammatory brake, the cortisol signal, can no longer efficiently suppress the production of pro-inflammatory cytokines, things like IL-6, IL-12, and IL-17. So the body enters this state of chronic low-grade inflammation.
And this is an obvious inflammation like a swollen ankle.
No, it's subtle, it's systemic, and it is devastating over time.
What are the systemic consequences of this brake failing?
This chronic inflammation underlies so many of the issues we see with burnout. Things like heightened pain sensitivity and increased susceptibility to autoimmune conditions. Clinical data often shows elevated cortisol in some autoimmune patients. And it also drives musculoskeletal breakdown.
The muscle wasting and chronic pain.
Yes, chronic glucocorticoid exposure causes muscle wasting. And the sources specifically note that females may be more susceptible to this HPA-driven chronic muscle pain, which really underscores that we have to consider sex differences in the pathophysiology of stress. The body is essentially slowly destroying itself because its own anti-inflammatory regulator has lost its authority.
So the biological infrastructure is just crumbling. The hippocampus is shrinking, the stress thermostat is broken, the body is inflamed. And in response to feeling this terrible, the common advice is to just push through.
Work harder, be more disciplined.
But that impulse is fundamentally biologically counterproductive because chronic stress actually destroys the very engine of motivation itself.
That is the tragic irony of burnout. The system that is so damaged by chronic stress is the dopamine system, which is what controls your motivation, your experience of pleasure, and your reward-seeking behavior.
You can't discipline your way out of a dopamine deficiency.
You absolutely cannot. Chronic stress creates severe instability in the dopamine system, especially in the pathways that project to the prefrontal cortex and the nucleus accumbens, which is a key reward center.
And what does that instability feel like?
It manifests in profound and debilitating ways. A marked reduction in motivation and drive. A diminished capacity to feel pleasure in things that you used to enjoy.
A condition called anhedonia.
Anhedonia, yes. Also, difficulty focusing, impaired decision-making when it comes to risk and reward, and sometimes, paradoxically, you see increased risk-taking behavior, which is driven by this desperate search for a stronger stimulus to feel anything.
It sounds like the brain's internal reward meter just becomes less sensitive.
That's the perfect analogy. The reward meter is recalibrated downward. It now requires a much stronger stimulus, a bigger reward, a more intense sensation, a more dramatic win, to register the same level of pleasure or satisfaction you used to get from small, everyday joys.
Which explains the characteristic nothing matters anymore feeling of burnout.
It does. And crucially, studies show that these stress-induced changes in the dopamine system can persist long after the stressful situation itself has ended. That's why recovery is so slow and requires so much more than just stopping work. It requires active neurological repair.
This leads us directly to defining burnout, not as a subjective feeling, but as a definable neurocognitive condition.
Exactly. Clinically, burnout is characterized by these two distinct forces. You have energetic depletion, which comes from excessive demands, and you have motivational withdrawal, which comes from a poverty of rewarding
And the
resources.
prevalence is staggering.
It is around 18% in the general working population, but it can be over 50% in high-demand caring professions like medicine or teaching. But the real deep dive here is that we can now identify burnout by its unique electrophysiological footprint using EEG markers.
Okay, we're getting into the really technical brainwave data now. So let's slow down and define these markers with clear analogy so everyone can follow. What's the first signature, the one related to impaired attention?
The first signature is a breakdown in attention, which we can measure with the P3B amplitude. The P3B is an electrical wave that your brain generates roughly 300 milliseconds after you perceive a significant or relevant event. It reflects the cognitive resources you're allocating to update your working memory.
And what happens to it in people suffering from burnout?
We see a robust reduction in P3B amplitude. And this reduction scales directly with the severity of the exhaustion. So think of the P3B as your brain's internal spotlight that illuminates what's important right now.
In burnout, that spotlight is perpetually dim.
Exactly. The brain loses its efficiency in focusing and prioritizing, which makes everything feel equally urgent and at the same time equally dull.
So that feeling of being completely overwhelmed where nothing feels truly important, that's not just a mood, it's a measurable neurological deficit in how your brain allocates resources.
Precisely. We also see a weakening of another wave called the P3A, which is the automatic filter for things that are new or surprising. And this loss of efficiency is key because it often precedes any visible decline in your behavior or performance. Your brain is operating less efficiently long before anyone, including you, realizes how badly you're suffering.
Wow. Now, the second neurological signature, this one related to faulty error processing, is the most paradoxical. It involves two waves, the ERN and the PS. Let's start with the first one.
The ERN, or the error-related negativity, this is the brain's early alarm signal. It's generated in the anterior cingulate cortex within milliseconds of you making a mistake. It's that immediate subconscious oops signal.
And in burnout sufferers, this signal is...
It's heightened.
Why? That seems so counterintuitive. If they're exhausted, why is their error alarm set to maximum sensitivity?
This is the hypervigilance signature of burnout. The brain is so anxious and so overloaded that it detects every single tiny slip-up with this sharpened automatic vigilance. It's like having an internal alarm bell that rings violently every time you drop a pen or miss a comma in an email.
So you feel permanently on edge, just waiting for the next mistake.
That's the feeling. You feel constantly scrutinized, even by your own brain. But the second component of this, the error positivity, or P, reveals the real functional problem.
Okay, so what is the P?
The P is the later stage wave. It reflects your conscious awareness and evaluation of the mistake. It's the part of the brain that says, okay, I made a mistake. How do I learn from this and adjust my behavior so I don't do it again?
And in burnout, the P is.
It's significantly smaller. It's blunted.
Okay, so let's put that whole profile together for the listener. The individual is hypervigilant, so their internal alarm, the ERNA, is screaming at every little error.
But their capacity to consciously process that error and learn from it, the P, is shut down.
That is the tragic neurocognitive loop of burnout.
It is. You feel incredibly anxious and vigilant about every mistake you make. But because the P is blunted, you struggle to convert that immediate detection into a strategic, adaptive change. You keep making the same types of mistakes because the learning pathway has been disabled.
It's a physiological shift from proactive control, where you're anticipating and preventing errors, to this exhausting reactive control, this frenzied vigilance after the error has already happened.
And we're talking about chronic strain physically changing the brain's communication patterns. The source material lays out a clear trajectory of cortical reorganization, which we can track through coherence. That's the synchronization of electrical activity between different brain regions.
Walk us through those three measurable stages of decline.
So in the initial phase, which we can call tension, as stress starts to ramp up, we actually see local coherence in the theta and alpha brainwave bands surge.
So the brain is trying to compensate.
It's the brain's initial compensatory effort. It's scrambling to tighten its internal communication links to try and stabilize performance under this new higher load. It's actively trying to hold it all together.
But it can't sustain that. What happens next in the resistance phase?
In the resistance phase, this frontal hypercoherence emerges, but what's remarkable is that it becomes sex-lateralized.
Meaning it's different for men and women.
Exactly. In female subjects, new high-alpha links tend to appear specifically in the left frontal lobe. In male subjects, the corresponding pattern emerges in the right frontal lobe.
That's a critical insight. It suggests the neurological coping circuit itself might be hormone modulated and fundamentally different between the sexes.
It really suggests that when the brain tries to resist collapse, it recruits distinct networks based on sex, perhaps reflecting underlying differences in hormonal regulation or even pre-existing network structures. It underscores that stress management cannot be one size fits all.
And finally, what happens in the exhaustion phase?
Finally, in the exhaustion phase, the sophisticated, long-range alpha-3 connectivity begins to fragment. It just breaks apart, especially when the brain is engaged with the external world with your eyes open.
The physical breakdown of the entire communication network.
Yes. Those large integrated networks that you need for complex global processing, like pulling together multiple pieces of information for strategic planning, they start to break apart. And this fragmentation corresponds directly to the observable symptoms: the diminished cognitive efficiency, the exhaustion, and the attentional deficits we saw with that blunted P3B wave. It's a literal neurological collapse.
Okay, so it's abundantly clear now that the problem is not a simple need for a weekend off. We are facing measurable physical damage: hippocampal atrophy, dopamine system instability, receptor resistance, fragmenting neural networks.
Which means the standard advice to just relax is profoundly insufficient.
So we need to define what real neurological recovery actually looks like.
And the first thing is to shatter that myth of instant relaxation. Chronic stress takes months, often years to accumulate, and recovery is not achieved in a single weekend. We can't achieve true reversibility.
Meaning we can't just roll the clock back to zero as if it never happened.
Exactly. The scientific goal isn't reversibility, it's redirection. It's about changing the negative trajectory of your future behavior and your physiology and pointing it in a more positive, adaptive direction.
So if the trajectory is set by these deep epigenetic changes in receptor sensitivities, how on earth do we redirect it?
To change these deeply ingrained pathways, the literature is clear. Both pharmacological agents in some cases and behavioral therapies must work together to open up windows of plasticity in the brain.
And the good news is the brain is plastic.
The brain is remarkably plastic, even the adult hippocampus. And this plasticity gives us real hope for therapies that leverage the powerful brain-body connection.
Which brings us to the most direct route for manually downshifting the nervous system, targeting the vagus nerve.
The vagus nerve, the wandering nerve, is the key player here. It's the 10th cranial nerve, and it's massive. It connects the brain to virtually every major organ: your heart, your lungs, your entire gut. And it is the primary component of the parasympathetic or rest and digest nervous system.
So how does it interact with the HPA axis to put the brakes on stress?
The vagus nerve directly regulates the hypothalamus. It influences the entire HPA axis cascade right from the top down. When chronic stress dominates, it suppresses what we call vagal tone, creating a state of dysautonomia.
An imbalance.
An imbalance where the sympathetic fight or flight branch is stuck in overdrive, and the parasympathetic rest and digest branch is weak and suppressed.
So strengthening your vagal tone is like boosting the body's own anti-stress signal. How does vagus nerve stimulation, or VNS, specifically help reverse some of the physical damage we've been talking about?
VNS provides this active mechanism for downshifting the entire nervous system. On a systemic level, it has potent anti-inflammatory effects by attenuating macrophage activation, so it directly counters the chronic low-grade inflammation caused by that receptor resistance.
And what about for cognitive repair?
This is the crucial part. VNS enhances the function of serotonin and norepinephrine neurons, and most significantly, it induces neuronal plasticity in the hippocampus.
Wait, say that again. It induces plasticity in the hippocampus. That means it's actively working to reverse the dendritic shrinkage and the suppression of neurogenesis that's caused by chronic cortisol.
It is actively helping to repair the neural architecture. And while clinical VNS is a specialized medical procedure, the functional insight for us is that incorporating practices that enhance your own vagal tone can directly address these neurological imbalances and accelerate healing. You can stimulate your vagus nerve behaviorally.
Okay, what are some practical, evidence-based ways people listening can stimulate their vagal tone right now?
There are 3 very easy applications. First is diaphragmatic breathing, or just slow-paced breathing. When you slow your exhale so it's longer than your inhale, you directly stimulate the vagus nerve because it's highly sensitive to your breath rhythm.
So a pattern like breathing in for 4 seconds and out for 6 or 8 seconds.
Exactly. Doing that for just 5 minutes can reliably enhance your vagal activity. Second, humming or gargling.
Humming, really?
Yes. The vagus nerve runs right near your vocal cords, so humming, singing loudly, chanting, it creates vibrations that stimulate the nerve. Gargling vigorously with water until your eyes start to tear is also a very powerful stimulant.
And the third one, which requires a bit more, bracing.
Cold exposure. Brief, intentional exposure to cold water. This could be ending your shower with 30 seconds of cold or even just splashing ice water on your face. It's a proven, rapid way to activate the vagus nerve. The initial shock is a mild, acute stressor, but the nerve quickly kicks in to stabilize the system, and doing this regularly builds your resilience over time.
Those are really powerful, active interventions. Now let's pivot to the foundational support. Since the HPA axis is running the whole show, what daily strategies can support its healthy rhythm?
The first, and honestly the most crucial strategy, is still sleep optimization. We saw how poor sleep just feeds that vicious stress loop. Quality sleep is non-negotiable for HPA axis recovery. It's the only time your hormonal rhythms can rebalance.
So it allows that evening cortisol to finally drop so melatonin can rise.
Exactly. And then in the morning, you have to intentionally support that healthy HPA axis spike.
By supporting a healthy cortisol awakening response.
Yes, the SAR. This is key to resetting your entire rhythm for the day. And the most potent tool we have for this is exposing your eyes to morning sunlight immediately after waking up. And definitely before you check your phone.
Can you explain the neurobiological mechanism there? Why is sunlight so powerful for this?
When morning light hits your retina, it stimulates specialized cells that contain a photopigment called melanopsin. The signals from these cells bypass your visual cortex and travel directly to the suprachiasmatic nucleus, or SCN.
The brain's master clock.
The master circadian clock. The SCN then signals the hypothalamus to initiate that proper healthy cortisol spike. This sets the clock for the entire day and ensures that the evening signal to drop cortisol is strong and timely. 15 minutes of morning light exposure is a non-negotiable biological command.
So putting down the phone for a few minutes and stepping outside is literally sending a command to your HPA axis to stop misfiring later in the day.
It is a deliberate neurobiological necessity. And finally, we have to address nutrient depletion. Chronic stress is metabolically expensive. The constant demands of the HPA axis, the perpetual need to synthesize neurotransmitters, it rapidly depletes your stores of essential vitamins and minerals.
Okay, so which nutrients are the most critical for supporting the HPA axis and helping it repair?
We have to replenish 4 key areas. First, vitamin C. It's essential for the synthesis of all adrenal hormones, and it's a critical antioxidant that protects the very cells that produce cortisol.
Second,
Magnesium. It is rapidly depleted during chronic stress because it's vital for regulating the stress response itself, for relaxing muscle tissue, and for assisting in sleep regulation.
that magnesium depletion definitely contributes to that chronic muscle pain and the inability to physically relax.
Absolutely. Third, the B vitamins, especially B5 and B6. They are critical cofactors for energy production in the mitochondria and for overall nervous system function. When you feel drained, you are likely depleted of the fuel needed to generate ATP.
And
Omega-3 fatty acids, particularly EPA and DHA. These are crucial for building healthy cell membranes in your brain, supporting overall brain function, and for modulating the inflammation response. They help to quiet that chronic low-grade inflammation caused by GRR.
this just shows that recovery isn't passive. It's an active, multi-pronged strategic intervention. It's combining behavioral downshifting, nutritional support, and intentional circadian rhythm regulation.
And recovery involves establishing radical boundaries, because if chronic stress has systemic, measurable neurological consequences of overload, then the interventions have to be systemic too. They must combine things like mindfulness, gentle movement like yoga or Tai Chi, and establishing ironclad boundaries around your work and digital connectivity to protect that precious prefrontal cortex from further depletion.
So this deep dive has really confirmed the neurobiological reality behind that wired but tired paradox. We started with what feels like a personal exhaustion, maybe even a sense of failure.
But the science gives us a measurable, quantifiable, and predictable biological explanation for it.
That low-grade, constant cognitive load of modern life literally hijacks the HPA axis. And the result is cortisol-induced atrophy in the brain, dopamine instability, and this profound inflammatory resistance.
And the core message for you to take away is clear. Stress is a biological state. It is not a personal failure. The neurobiological data shows, without a doubt, that chronic stress causes a maladaptive shift in key neural circuits. The PFC, the dopamine system, the hippocampus, that requires strategic, active intervention and time to redirect.
You cannot simply willpower your way back to reversibility.
No, you must actively engage the tools of redirection, stimulating the vagus nerve, managing your circadian hygiene, and providing targeted nutritional support.
And that distinction between acute and chronic stress, it really reveals the key vulnerability of the modern human. Acute stress can actually enhance memory and attention.
But that toxic combination of factors, the high amygdala arousal, the impaired prefrontal control, and the elevated cortisol, that is what truly mimics severe, uncontrollable stress and just impairs our capacity to thrive. So if we accept that we can't eliminate all the chronic digital and cognitive inputs in our lives,
Then we have to focus our energy on strengthening the regulatory systems, like the vagus nerve and the prefrontal cortex, that control how our brain interprets and processes those stimuli. If you understand that your body's stress response is running hot because the anti-inflammatory brake has failed, you know exactly where to apply pressure. So the question to leave you with is this. What is the single non-negotiable boundary or vagal tone practice you will implement today to interrupt that cycle of overload?
If this helped reboot your human OS, subscribe for daily upgrades. Drop a comment on what new update you installed today. Share this with someone running on low battery.